Hello, and welcome to this Morpheus Tech Brief on Morpheus and the Ansible Automation Platform. I'm Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. So for those that are unfamiliar with the Ansible Automation Platform, it is the platform previously known as Ansible Tower, which is what most folks commonly know it by as. It provides the capabilities to facilitate automation as well as orchestration in a single platform. In particular, it essentially acts as the UI as well as API wrapper around the open source Ansible tool. A number of its use cases are varied, but common ones are configuration management. So leveraging Ansible via the Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform to be able to configure systems such as their operating systems. So lay down a file, install a package, restart and manage a service are common things that are done for configuration management tools. Additionally, network automation. So leveraging Ansible via the automation platform to be able to configure and manage network devices such as routers, switches, firewalls, and the like. Application deployment. So utilizing Ansible in an orchestration and automation fashion to be able to coordinate the deployment or upgrade of an application that is running on a workload. And then finally, security automation. So similar to what we saw from the network automation side, being able to leverage Ansible's ability to be able to interact with various systems, both operating systems as well as network devices and API endpoints, to be able to facilitate security automation in response to given events that may be a detected alert, and then being able to take remediative or additional debugging or troubleshooting actions that then reach out to other systems to collect and gather information. So that's what the Ansible Automation Platform or the Ansible Tower platform does, is provide that functionality. So how does the Morpheus platform work with Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform to be able to take advantage of a number of the benefits and capabilities that we talked about that are available via that platform, and then be able to leverage those in various different contexts within Morpheus platform? So the Morpheus platform provides the ability to be able to integrate with Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform via REST API. So Morpheus platform will make various REST API calls to be able to trigger the execution of what Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform refers to them as is job templates. Essentially what that becomes is a definition of a template that defines things like the particular playbook that should be run, the credentials that should be associated with that execution, various different parameters that define configuration for the execution of that Ansible playbook. So Morpheus is going to be able to trigger the execution of job templates as part of an automation task. And we'll dig into what that looks like from the platform's perspective in a minute. Additionally, being able to integrate with the inventory. So in the case of Ansible, what it relies on is what's known as an inventory to define the systems that it can interact with. Additionally, it can leverage that inventory for additional metadata or variables that can be defined for those given systems. So as an example, if I had a web server that I wanted to interact with utilizing Ansible, I would add that workload to the Ansible inventory to then be able to execute playbooks against that particular system. Similar fashion, Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform has an inventory that can be utilized and leveraged to be able to define which systems can be utilized as endpoint targets. And so what Morpheus will do is be able to interact with the inventory as part of its various processes to populate the inventory with a system that Morpheus knows about to be able to trigger that particular operation, or existing systems that Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform knows about, and then be able to interact with those systems as well. So there's a number of capabilities that this starts to provide. One of the things we talked about was the ability to be able to perform configuration management, solutions or options. So being able to interact with things like Windows systems, Ubuntu, Red Hat, so on and so forth, to be able to perform various operations both from a management perspective, so doing things like managing package installation, as well as various different file system permissions and so forth and so on, but also being able to then leverage that for infrastructure centric operations that may interact with various network devices, storage devices, hypervisors, or even public clouds to perform a gamut of particular operations. So now that we know about the Ansible Automation Platform, we have a high-level overview of how it interacts with the Morpheus platform and how the two work together to be able to perform operations. Let's take a look at what that looks like from a Morpheus perspective. So within the Morpheus platform, there is the ability to, as I said, be able to add that Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation integration. And then once that's been added, there's the ability to be able to add a Ansible Tower job task within the Morpheus platform. So in this particular slide, we have an example of an Ansible Tower job that has been added. So it's leveraging, in this case, the A Tower integration. And then we see a number of pieces of information that we previously talked about, the inventory as well as the job template. So the Morpheus platform is going to sync that information in to provide the ability to be able to select those as part of the creation of a given task. So I can select an inventory as well as a job template. Certainly dependent upon the architecture of the environment, it is advised to create a dedicated inventory for Morpheus objects or Morpheus operations, certainly depending upon what the operation is. So as an example, if it is a provisioning operation that is primarily utilized within the Morpheus platform, so utilizing Morpheus to provision workloads and then integrating with Ansible Tower to configure those systems to perform post-provisioning operations, it may be ideal to create a dedicated inventory that Morpheus can then manage as part of practices that you might leverage in your organization. Additionally, there may be a case of where you want to expose this for maybe various day two operations as an example. And you may want to leverage an existing inventory that you then want to allow Morpheus to expose up to be able to run operations against those systems, whether they be machines or whether they be things like network devices or storage devices. Certainly, there's also that possibility. So the Morpheus platform is going to be able to tie in to the Ansible Tower integration and expose that via a task. In this case, I could add the task to a provisioning workflow during its various phases to utilize that for post-provisioning for teardown. I could also add it to an operational workflow, possibly for a sequence of day two operations that may want to string together and expose that through a self-service catalog. Or I could just keep it as a standalone task that I may want to leverage for a specific day two operation. And so we've talked about some of these integration touch points. Now let's take a deeper look into what that actually looks like from a Morpheus platform perspective. So in this case, I have Jane. Jane needs a web server. And so she logs into Morpheus. Jane might have a self-service catalog item, or she may go through the provisioning wizard, but she needs a web server. So in the case of the Morpheus platform, as an example, I want to provision an Ubuntu VM into a VMware vSphere environment. Could be any number of the other clouds that Morpheus platform supports, such as AWS, Azure, GCP, a handful of other on-prem particular environments. And once the provisioning of that virtual machine has taken place, I now want to be able to leverage Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform to facilitate the installation and configuration of the web server on this particular system. So in this example, I'm utilizing what would be a plain or vanilla Ubuntu VM, and then performing system configuration during the post-provisioning process of this workload. And so what I would do is be able to rely on the integration with the Ansible Tower or the Ansible Automation Platform to be able to perform that operation. And so what Morpheus would do once it hits that post-provisioning process is the Morpheus platform knows about information for that particular Ubuntu VM, things like the IP address in particular. And so being able to utilize that information to then populate the Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation inventory the inventory that we talked about that the platform relies on to be able to identify or target the specific systems. So we would populate that inventory during that process. And then once that's done, we would then utilize that to launch the job template from the Ansible Automation or Ansible Tower perspective, at which point it would trigger and be able to perform the configuration of that system. So let's take a look at the Morpheus platform to see how a number of these pieces come together. So here we are in the Morpheus platform. One of the things that I mentioned was that initial integration. So if I come to administration integrations, we can see that I have a Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform integration. And so there's a number of pieces of data that we're able to pull back into the Morpheus UI about this particular environment. In this particular example, I'm actually using AWX, which is the upstream version of Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation Platform. And so in this case, we see that we have basic summary. We have templates, in this case, job templates that we talked about, which define the configuration for that particular playbook execution. We have jobs, which are the runs or executions of the actual job templates. So job templates provide a templating mechanism, and jobs are the execution of those. And then finally, the various Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation Platform inventories that the Morpheus platform can see. So once we add the integration, so what we would leverage is URL, username, password for the integration to get the integration set up. Codeless integration, quickly get started, add that. Morpheus platform is going to sync in this information that we see here, and it will also sync it in on a regular basis. So one of the things to be mindful of is, let's say if there's a change that is made on the Ansible Automation or Ansible Tower side, let's say you add a new template or update something that like an inventory, it may take a few minutes for Morpheus to perform a refresh operation to resync that. So certainly something to be aware of as you're working with the integration. Now that we've got the integration added, we can come into automation. And in this case, we have a number of tasks that have already been added. As I mentioned, we have the ability to be able to add in Ansible Tower job type from an automation standpoint within the Morpheus platform. So I can specify the name, the code, the labels, those various things. When we get down to Tower integration, we see that this references the integration that we just took a look at. We have inventory. So there are a number of inventories that have been added on the Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation side. Let's take a look at that. So as I said, running AWX, which is the upstream variant of those two particular systems. And so in AWX, which is the akin to Tower, let's take a look and we need to log in. We could take a look here and see we have various templates. So as I said, we want to define templates. Let's take a look at an existing template. This is the one that comes included out of the box. So it defines various different pieces of information or settings. So as we see, inventory, things like project, things like playbook, things like credentials are defined here. And so the number of these constructs are what we're going to see on the Morpheus side that Morpheus is then going to be able to leverage and interact with. And so in particular, a number of items that are important, certainly included in the documentation, but do want to highlight things like being able to specify on the job template inventory as an example. So if we come back into Morpheus, we see that we have a pick list for inventory. This is dependent upon specifying that you want to prompt on launch. And so what that's going to do is provide the ability to be able to override the default that's defined here. So in this case, if I didn't click prompt on launch, what would always run would be that demo inventory. Now on the Morpheus side, it wouldn't actually be able to override it. So I would ensure that that is clicked to perform on launch. In this case, I also have job list or job template, which is another pick list. So I can specify a number of these various job templates that we see on the Ansible Tower side. I can specify group. In this case, that's going to align with Ansible groups to be able to perform various different architectural solutions or options where I may want to have a dedicated group for, let's say, databases or web server when I'm doing more complex orchestrated operations. I can specify SCM override. In this case, we're not going to worry about that. I also have execute mode. So being able to specify what I want to scope that execution to. So we got limit to instance, limit to group, run for all, skip execution. In this case, I would leave it, I'm going to leave it as limit to instance. And so it's going to align to what we see here from execute target standpoint. So the execute target on the Morpheus side is going to define that, in this case, when I provision my Ubuntu VM to stand up my web server, I want the resource that Morpheus is provisioning to be the target for the execution of that. And so it's also going to align with the limit to instance part. So let's take a look at our web install as an example. So I have an inventory, a dedicated inventory, Morpheus inventory. I also have a job template for Morpheus demo. I'm limiting to instance, and then I am targeting to that specific resource. And so for this particular scenario, I want to run this as part of the stand-up of a workload. So I've created the task. I also need to create a provisioning workflow to then link to my instance during the stand-up process. And so now I've got my workflow created. In this case, the only task that I have is web install. And so we added that to the workflow. And I've also added the workflow to an Ansible Nginx layout. So we see here, I've got my workflow attached. And so when I go to spin up this workflow, what's going to happen is Morpheus is going to provision the instance in my VMware vSphere environment. And then during the provisioning process of this workload, the particular Ansible Tower job is going to kick off, perform that configuration and that installation. And so let's take a look at an instance that I've already provisioned as an example. So we'll come and take a look at the history of this particular system. So we perform the provisioning operations. And we see one of the things that was done was to run that web install as part of the deployment or installation process. So that's the hook point. So we'll kick off one of those as we take a look at some of the other functionality. So Ansible Nginx. So in this case, the playbook that I'm utilizing is taking custom options. So this is a great time to talk about the passing of Morpheus variables or the abilities to be able to pass Morpheus variables to the execution of the job template. So in my example, I have a web server that I'm actually updating the default web page for an Nginx instance to include the message that I've defined here in this Morpheus input. So I click next. I could also add a workflow here if I wanted to edit dynamically, but we already have the workflow attached to our instance in the instance layout. Let's click complete. So that's going to go away. So one of the things that I talked about was the variables that get added. So let's take a look. So I think it's this one. So variables. So in this case, this particular execution of the job template came from the Morpheus platform and includes variables that are populated. So let's expand this. So this provides us the ability to be able to leverage these Morpheus provided variables within our playbooks executed from Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation Platform. So there's a lot of data that can be leveraged about the execution of this particular Ansible job template. So things like job template ID, along with that, common information from the Morpheus platform perspective that you would expect during the provisioning of an instance. I can get information about things like the IP address, custom inputs that I've defined, the particular environment that that system lives in, as well as others. So let's take a look for our custom options. Let's see. So I'm going to close some of these items. So we took a look during the provisioning of that workload. There was a message that it wanted me to provide. And so what we want to do now is see if we can see the message for the previous execution. Here it is. So custom options. And the message that I had for this previous execution was I heart Morpheus. And so when we go to that particular system, so let's take a look. Or the one that's already been deployed. And so we have our landing page, and the message that was utilized was I heart Morpheus. And so what we're relying upon and leveraging is the integration between the Morpheus platform and Ansible Tower, Ansible Automation Platform to facilitate that all the way through to the deployment of this particular system. Certainly, it could be something that is leveraged for tying systems together, potentially like an IP address or a DNS name or various things that I might utilize those inputs to populate as part of a stand-up process. In this case, we got the basic example of I heart Morpheus. I could have used any of these other variables as part of that process. And so that provides the ability to be able to leverage Morpheus constructs to provide that data from a user input perspective during the stand-up of that workload, and then tie that all the way through into the Ansible Automation Platform. All right, so this one is still standing up. Let's take a look if it's gotten to the Ansible part. Nope, still taking a second. One of the things we'll take a look at and probably come back to in a moment, but is day two operations. So we talked about the ability to be able to interact with those job templates in various fashions. So let's take a look at another example of how we could leverage that integration. As an example, Jane says, I need to update a system. So this could be any number of things. Could mean I need to update a package. Could mean I need to uninstall a package. Could be need to write a file as an example. So let's take a look at what Jane's doing. So in the case, Jane can come into the Morpheus platform and say, you know what, I want to execute this particular operation. And on the back end, it can be fulfilled by an Ansible Automation Platform, or Ansible Tower job template to perform the given operation against a system. In this case, I could run it against that Ubuntu VM. It could also be a, as I said, network device or storage device, or even an API endpoint as part of that particular operation. So if we come back into the Morpheus platform, we can see about a day two Ansible task. So in this case, I've got a job template for Morpheus day two. Let's come back into AWX. Morpheus day two. So I've got a day two playbook, Morpheus inventory for the prompt on launch, and then credentials that have been defined. And so I can then come into Morpheus and make sure everything is correct. So I got the inventory that I want. I have the template that I want, as well as limiting to that instance. And so I could trigger or execute this day two task, which I actually already have. And so what it did was it actually reached out to the system that we had already stood up, and it created a file on the file system. So let's come take a look at that particular system. So a demo 01. Let's see if we can get to the console. All right, so grab a console. that up so we can see better. All right, oh, if I remember the password. All right, there we go. So in this case, I know where it was supposed to have written it. It was in the temp directory. So Morpheus day 2. And so what it actually did was it wrote Morpheus and Ansible Automation Platform day 2 operation. Certainly an example, but it showcases the capability that this could offer or provide to be able to perform various operational management tasks against systems or API endpoints, as I said. So let's come back into the Morpheus platform. And it looks like our next one finished. So let's take a look at the history. It's going to be very similar to what we saw for the first one that we took a look at. So it's going to run through those various different operations to perform a installation of Nginx to ensure that Nginx is started, to update the default homepage or default web page for Nginx. And then finally, it's going to open up firewall for port 80 to allow that access. So let's take a look. So in this case, it is 16. And so in this case, we have Morpheus tech brief and then testing the Morpheus integration, which is what we entered in for our message when we went to provision the system. So that showcases a number of the capabilities that the platform offers to open up. So as an example, I could also expose that day 2 task via the Morpheus self-service catalog, as well as exposing the provisioning of that instance that we took a look at to really simplify the process and leverage the Ansible Automation or Ansible Tower platform for the automation and orchestration of system configuration and even day 2 management. So we've walked through a number of things during this tech brief, talking from what is the Ansible Automation Platform, how the Morpheus platform integrates with it by leveraging the REST APIs to be able to do things like add workloads to inventory, to launch job templates, also the ability to be able to surface or bring in things like the inventory and the job templates for reference in task operations. And then we looked at how we can bring all that together to be able to stand up a workload in an end-to-end automated fashion, leveraging Morpheus' abilities to be able to tie into things like hypervisors and public clouds, and then be able to trigger the execution in an orchestrated fashion of an Ansible Tower or Ansible Automation Platform job template to fully configure that system. And then also took a look at ways in which we could utilize it for day 2 operations for existing systems that have already been provisioned. So definitely appreciate the time and thank you for joining me during this Morpheus Tech Brief.